Hello, my name is Paige Newman, and I'm the Manuscript Collections Curator. Welcome to Curators at Work, a monthly series where members of our curatorial team share stories about working with the museum's remarkable collections and discuss the work we're doing to shape a better understanding of Virginia's complex history. For those of you joining us live on Facebook and YouTube, feel free to post your questions and feedback in the comments section throughout the program, and we'll respond to as many as possible during or after the presentation. None of the work that we do would be possible without the generous support of our members. The VMHC does not receive state operating support, and it's through private donations that we're able to preserve and share Virginia's story and offer programs like this. So thank you. Today's Curators at Work is Treasures from the Collection. We'll explore rare items from the VMHC's nearly 200-year-old collection, including letters from Virginia's founding fathers, records of the Virginia Company of London that founded the Jamestown colony, early publications that define human rights, and documents that reject human slavery. So let's get started. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Bill Rasmussen.
Thank you, Paige. Paige and I have selected from the 9 million manuscripts and books and other objects in our collection. We've selected 10 of them. And we picked the range from the Jamestown, from the founding of the Virginia colony up to the Civil War. So these are incredibly important objects, and I think that'll become clear as we go through them. So we might as well start at the very beginning. We're going to do this in chronological order. And what you're looking at is one of 3 volumes that are copies of the records of the Virginia Company of London. Now, this was a stock company that was granted a royal charter by James I, and it went on to, the Virginia Company founded Jamestown, obviously, in 1607. But their charter is recorded here in this book, and is written in 1606, and we'll look at a page there in a minute. But I'll mention that Jefferson made a copy because he was interested in states' rights, and our copy has the bookmark of John Randolph, who was another Virginian who was interested in states' rights. He's a generation younger than Jefferson, but their lives overlapped. And Jefferson ended up selling these books to the Library of Congress, so that's how that came about. And I think it's probably a safe conclusion to say that John Randolph's copy was copied from Thomas Jefferson's copy, because Jefferson's copy is a little bit longer. But we have 3 huge volumes, and if you were a copyist in the colonial and late 18th century, you had beautiful handwriting. These things are incredible. So it's hundreds of pages. And Jefferson's copy at the Library of Congress is online. So if you have several weeks or maybe months and you want to read it all, it's there online to read. But we've turned it to one page, which is the charter of the records of the Virginia Company. And down at the bottom, well, it says that the king made promises that Virginians would remember in 1776. And the passage we're looking at there is you see, it says that any of the people that live in the colonies, right at the very top in plantations, and every of their children, which will happen to be born with any of the limits and precincts of the several colonies and plantations, shall have and enjoy all the liberties, franchises, and immunities within any of our other dominions, to all limits and intents and purposes. And what's significant about that, and why Jefferson and Randolph were interested in this original charter, is that in 1776, Americans in all of the colonies were complaining that their rights had been denied, that the king and Jefferson particularly blamed the king, that they had lost the right to vote, they had been taxed, they had no representation, and so they couldn't control what was going on in Parliament. They were overtaxed. When goods were coming to them through England or to England, there were taxes on top of that. They were not allowed to trade freely. There was a lot of trading done illicitly with Dutch merchants, but that wasn't allowed. So Jefferson then was interested in this because it enabled him to complain in 1776 and also in 1774, as I'll show you in a second, that these promises had been denied. And so if we look at the next object, it's a booklet that Jefferson wrote in 1774, a summary review of the rights of British America. And this is what got Jefferson the assignment to draft the Declaration of Independence 2 years later, because here he dares to criticize the British king for what he says unwarrantable encroachments and usurpations upon the rights of British America. And he says that these taxes and trade restrictions have been going on since 1765. And the logical conclusion of this, he writes in this document, is that Parliament has no right to exercise authority over us. Now, Jefferson just appears out of the blue. He's only 31 years old when he writes this. And he writes this in Williamsburg. And our copy is printed by Clementina Rhine, who's the story, she's important in herself because a woman running a very successful printing company after her husband died. But that's another story. And Jefferson just decides that the people that are going to meet representing the various colonies in Philadelphia, they should send a message to the king and tell him that he is their representative. He's simply the chief officer of the people. That was the phrase he used. And he says in this document that the king should take a view of these rights from the origin and first settlement of these countries. Those are his words. So in other words, Jefferson's saying that the king needs to go back and look at the charter of these rights that were promised to Virginians because they've been taken away. So we like to show these two documents together because it explains where Jefferson's coming from. And as I said, this document in 1774 earned Jefferson the assignment of writing the Declaration of Independence when he was only 33. But he obviously had an incredible ability to write, and that was part of it. But also he took a very bold stance at a very early age. So our next object is a remarkable one too. And this is a period printing of George George Mason's Virginia Declaration of Rights. It was written in Williamsburg in 1776 in June. It was a month before the Declaration of Independence, and it is full of all sorts of ideas that are familiar to all of us because we know them from the Declaration of Independence and we know them from the Constitution. So this is printed on both sides. We have it encapsulated. So I'm not going to talk about the front of it. I'll only show you the front of it. We encapsulate documents because it protects them, and every once in a while we put these on display, and they're better protected if they're sealed like this. So you see the Declaration of Rights. But look at number 1. There are 18 of these that are listed here of these rights. All men are created. All men are by nature equally free and independent and have certain inherent rights, namely the enjoyment of life and liberty, and obtaining happiness and safety. These are words that are very familiar to us because Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence, he says all men are created equal, they have unalienable rights, and among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now these ideas were in the air. They were actually written, first written 100 years earlier by some of the English, particularly the English and also the French philosophers. And John Locke is the English philosopher who's the easiest to track down. And he writes in 1689 that reason teaches that being all equal and independent, no one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions. So we start to see some of these words. They go all the way back to John Locke 100 years later. If you look at numbers 2 and 3, George Mason says that all the power is vested and derived from the people. And the purpose of government is to provide for happiness and safety of the people. And so in the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson takes that idea and says that to secure the rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Governments serve to effect the safety and happiness of the people. So that's exactly the same idea. And John Locke, 1689, said the same thing, that the power of any commonwealth should be directed to no other end but the peace, safety, and public good of the people. So Mason and Jefferson have taken all this from John Locke, and Jefferson never claimed that he came up with any of this material on his own in the Declaration of Independence, but he had an ability to put it into just almost poetry. Look at number 5. Talks about the legislative and executive powers of the state have to be separate and distinct. And of course, that's what we're very familiar with because that's in the Constitution. John Locke says the same thing. All the legislative and executive power come often to be separated in governments. So it goes back to Locke. Look at number 6. Elections, all men ought to have the right of suffrage. And of course, James Madison brings that into the Constitution. The House of Representatives shall be composed of members chosen every second year by the people of the several states. So this George Mason's idea, number 6, goes into the Constitution. I'll just mention quickly some of the ones on the back because some of them are really important. The idea, his 10th right that he mentions is the right of an impartial jury of 12 men. That's in charge in this document. Number 14, he talks about freedom of the press. George Mason says is one of the great bulwarks of liberty. And of course, that's a part of the First Amendment of the Constitution that James Madison writes. And John Locke puts it in a wonderful way. I know not why a man should not have liberty to print whatever he would speak. All goes back to the philosophers abroad. Number 15, George Mason in this document says that a well-regulated militia is proper for a defense of the state. And of course, that's part of, that's in the Second Amendment that James Madison writes to the Constitution. A well-regulated militia is necessary to the security of a free state. And so the right of people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. And lastly, one of the most important ones, George Mason, number 18, it talks about religious freedom. And George Mason writes, all men are equally entitled to the free exercise of religion. And of course, that's part of the First Amendment of the Constitution. And then of course, it's the whole issue in Jefferson's statute for religious freedom where he says that no man shall be compelled to frequent or support any religious worship. And John Locke wrote the same sort of thing in 1689, saying succinctly and logically, enforcing a single religion shall not have the effect so desired, because belief cannot be compelled by violence. So this is a remarkably important document in American history, and we value our copy, our period printing of it greatly, because of all the information, all those basic ideas that define what America is, and they're coming out of Virginia. Well, they came out of England and France before that, but they come in America, they first appear here. So we can move on to a letter. It's a letter from George Washington to his stepson, Jackie Custis. And this is one of the most valuable letters in our collection, because it's written in June of 1775. And he announces, he says, "Dear Jack, he's decided to accept command of the American forces. I've been called upon by the unanimous, you see at the top, the unanimous, something of the assembly to command the army." And then he says he didn't seek the position. However, this was at the Second Constitutional Convention, and he wore his military uniform to it. So he clearly sent a message by wearing his uniform. And there you can see it now. It's clear. I've been called upon by the unanimous voice of the colonies to take command of the Continental Army. It's an honor I neither sought after or was by any means fond of accepting, because he knew exactly what the risk was. Washington and Jefferson both had beautiful handwriting. We're very thankful for that as we read these documents. And to show how aware he was of how dangerous this was going to be, at the very bottom, he asked his stepson to look after his mother, Martha, and promote her quiet. And a day earlier, he had mailed his wife his newly written will. So he was well aware of what he was getting into. So that's a famous letter that I think a lot of people have known for a long time that we hold here. But I want to show you something now that's a little known. But it was apparent to a number of people after America announced all the rights that are in the Bill of Rights. Well, we're look at this one. All right, this is live. We're going to look at, this makes sense. We're dealing with George Washington. So we look at his diary. This is one of the best things in our collection. Actually, it makes more sense to do it this way, because we're going to look at two items that deal with the end of slavery. But this is George Washington's diary that deals with his first year, his first presidential administration. He kept his diary when the government was in New York and Philadelphia, and this was a time when the newly designed government was put into operation, and he had to decide how his role should be performed. So it's on some of the pages. It provides insights and decisions he made, how he should receive foreign or domestic visitors, and so on, how he spent his leisure time, and where he traveled. And we have it open here to his travel. Here, and this is interesting because he comes down this section in April '91. He comes down into Virginia. He stops at Richmond. He's entertained by the council and the mayor, has dinner with the governor, goes to Petersburg and says, well, it has about 3,000 people. And then he goes to Appomattox, Nottoway, and Meherrin. I'd look that one up. Meherrin is south of Farmville, the home of country singer, the birthplace of country singer Roy Clark. I think it was more important in 1791 than now. But anyway, he goes on and talks about the travel down there. He's concerned about the dust that he runs through in his travels. The roads were horrible. Here in the middle, he talks about he talks about what was planted around Petersburg, and you see right in the center, the lands are cultivated in tobacco, corn, wheat, and oats and tobacco. The raising of pork for market seems to be the principal dependence of the inhabitants, especially towards the Roanoke Valley and so on. And then he moves on down to Halifax and crosses the state line into North Carolina. It's a fascinating diary. When he gets down to South Carolina, he tells the roads are so bad that they took his carriage and his troop of people who accompanied him, and they rode along the beach, along the hard sand right next to the ocean, because it was much worse. It was a better road than anything they were finding in 1791. This diary is one of the most valuable things in our collection, and it is an interesting story how it came to us. It was a gift of James K. Marshall, who was one of the sons of John Marshall, and he was the executor of his father's estate. And also involved in it was John C. Hamilton, who was the son of Alexander Hamilton. And the two of them got together and decided this diary should go to the Virginia Historical Society. It had somehow stayed with John Marshall's papers, because John Marshall wrote a 5-volume biography of George Washington, and he must have had all of Washington's papers, and they're voluminous, shipped to him to his house in Richmond, because he wrote it somehow during the same time that he was Chief Justice of the United States. So he's obviously brilliant if he could write a 5-page biography at the same time he's running the Supreme Court. So it came to us through those two in the 1850s. And it's one of the greatest things we have. So we will go now, I think, Paige, to two of our documents that deal with the end of slavery. It was apparent to everyone when the Americans demanded that all men are equal, and they demanded rights, and they said, well, there's obviously a huge flaw here, and that they're slaves. And this is not right. And so it's not that well known that a number of people in Virginia decided to do something about it. We have a group of emancipation documents. We have several by this man, Richard Rowell. He's just a resident of Surrey County, and he turned out these documents and handed them to the slaves who were freed, because if they were stopped by someone and potentially arrested, they could show this document and prove that they had been freed, that they were free, and they could not be jailed. But he goes out of his way, and the others that wrote these documents, not just to say they're free, but he goes on to make a statement about why they're free. He says, I, Richard Rowell of Surrey County, Virginia, being fully persuaded that freedom is the natural right of all mankind, and it is my duty to do unto others as I would desire to be done by in the like situation, and having under my care one Negro who am heretofore held as a slave, I hereby emancipate. And then he fills in the name of, and one of them, the name is Sarah, and another one, the name is Sam. So he's applying the golden rule, and he puts that in the emancipation document. So these are little known but extremely important and important documents. And the next item we go show is a printed book that follows the same theme. And this is it's called a dissertation on slavery, with a proposal for the gradual abolition of it in the state of Virginia, published in Philadelphia in 1796 by St. George Tucker, who was it says on the title page, he was a law professor at the College of William and Mary and a judge. And he talks about the incompatibility of slavery with the philosophy of the American Revolution, that all men are created equal. And he proposes a plan for the end of it. However, he puts it on, well, there you see Montesquieu, another one of these philosophers, obviously a Frenchman here, and says the same sort of thing that John Locke was saying, that all men are equal. Slavery is contrary to the spirit of the Constitution. So Montesquieu lived from 1689 to 1755, so he was a little bit younger than John Locke, but he's one of those philosophers preaching the same arguments about equality. What happens to this is that as Tucker's writing this, there's the slave revolt in Haiti in 1791, and all of a sudden he gets a little cold feet, and he puts a proposal for the gradual abolition, and he puts it on such a slow pace that it wouldn't have worked. When Virginia slaveholders tried emancipating a lot of their slaves, as Robert Carter III did, it caused problems in the community because it didn't tend to release them all at the same time. It was fine for the ones who were released, but the ones who weren't had every reason to complain. And Tucker submitted this idea of gradual abolition to the Virginia legislature, and typically, like assemblies, they did nothing. So nothing happened. Nothing resulted from this. But at least it shows that there were people concerned about this, about slavery and about ending it. Now we're going to look at, it's one of the most important letters in our collection, and I think it's one of the most important letters in American history. It's a letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote to Walter Jones, and it's written in January of 1814. And if you want to read the whole thing on your own, all you have to do is Google Thomas Jefferson to Walter Jones, and you'll find it on print in a number of places. This is the first page. Walter Jones is somebody he'd known since college. They both were married at the same time. Walter Jones went on abroad to get a medical degree, and then he served in Congress. And he writes Jefferson in 1814. He says, "What was Washington really like? What was George Washington really like?" And so Jefferson writes this long letter back to him. Here in the first page, he complains about the newspapers at the time, saying how horrible, they're so political. It sounds just like today. Newspapers were political instruments. Parties controlled various newspapers. But then he goes on in the second and third pages, and here, let's see here. Here he says, he starts before just before you get to this, I'll mention the part. He says, Washington's mind was great and powerful, but it wasn't of the first order. His penetration strong, though not as acute as that of a Newton, Bacon, or Locke. Isaac Newton, Francis Bacon, and John Locke. We're familiar with him by now. And no judgment was ever found there, but it was slow in operation. He goes back and forth. Here it is, 15 years after Washington has died, and Jefferson can't let go of the fact that he and Washington had differences. The main difference was that Washington was very practical and really not realized that the new country wasn't going to survive unless the federal government was strong. Jefferson was visionary and believed in states' rights. So they had a lot of disagreements. On the other hand, they got along very well at times, and they shared so much together with one another over a 30-year period. So he goes on and then says his mind was slow in operation, but sure in conclusion. And no general planned his battles more judiciously, but if things were going bad, he was slow in readjustment. He often failed in the field. So that's what you're reading at the very top right now, that line. And then he goes on to say he was incapable of fear. He praises him, as calm as he could be under stress. His integrity was most pure. His justice was the most inflexible I've ever known. He was a wise, a good, and a great man. But then he has to come back and say, well, but he had a temper, his temper was naturally irritable and high-toned. He generally kept it under control, and Jefferson didn't like the fact that on occasion, Washington lost his temper with Jefferson. And then he says that Washington frowned on visionary projects. Well, he's talking about his own projects. But then he goes on to say his stature was exactly what one would wish, his deportment easy, the best horseman of his age. And then on the page after this, he said, well, he didn't have copious of ideas nor fluency of words, but he wrote readily, and he did read a little bit, although it's mostly agriculture and English history that he read. And he says, well, we were dissatisfied with Washington, with the British treaty, with the Jay Treaty. Washington was determined that the nation was not going to go to war as France and England were trying to obliterate one another. And he was determined to be neutral, and he decided he better side with England because they had the bigger navy. And Jefferson, of course, loved the French. So Jefferson criticized him for that. But then Jefferson says, we were dissatisfied with him on the ratification of the British treaty, but this was short-lived. And then Jefferson praised him. He was not a monarchist. And then he has this wonderful statement that he says about Jefferson. He often declared to me that he considered our new Constitution was an experiment on the practicability of Republican government and with what dose of liberty man could be trusted for his own good. That he was determined the experiment should have a fair trial, and he would lose the last drop of his blood in support of this experiment, of this new government. So, and then Washington had a firm confidence in the durability of our government. It's an absolutely remarkable letter. It's well worth reading. Google Thomas Jefferson to Walter Jones, 1814. And that's in our collection, and you sometimes wonder, how in the world do we get things like this? This was a gift of William Wilson Corcoran, who established the Corcoran Museum in Washington. And these were gifts in the late 19th century. And a number of the George Washington letters that we have were gifts from Corcoran. So we're certainly grateful for those gifts. And now we're going to look at two letters, and they're both from John Tyler, and they both deal with secession. One that didn't happen and one that did. So the first letter is written in 1832, and it's written to John Floyd, who was the governor of Virginia in 1832. And what has happened is that South Carolina has threatened to secede. The government, starting in the mid-20s, had passed tariffs to encourage and to help American manufacturers in the North get established, so they could compete with British imports. And the people in South Carolina realized they were having to pay more for their goods because they were getting taxed, so that the Americans would have a chance to compete with them. And so they threatened to secede. And so here he writes Floyd saying, it's now 2:15 in the night. I've been tossing and turning. I've sprung up from a restless bed to address you. And he says, I tremble for the Union, and equally as much for our Constitution. Not only the Union is in danger, but the rights, nay, the very existence of the states, he writes. He says, I am humbled, mortified, chagrined. He talks about the proclamation, the silly proclamation, and that's a reference to what Andrew Jackson issued a proclamation. Andrew Jackson said, if people in South Carolina want to secede, I'll lead an army down there and hang them all myself. And he's saying this is just making things worse. Sounds like Portland today and federal troops coming into Portland. And he writes, and I hope that we have enough time to resolve this thing. And of course, it does get resolved, and secession does not happen. And we have sort of the bookend to that. It's a remarkable letter that he writes to his wife. It's the next one we go look at. In April of 1861, April 17th. And Virginia has just seceded, and he's telling his wife. And at the very end of it, he says, trying times are before us. And he says at the very top, he says, Virginia has severed her connections with the northern hive of abolitionists and taken her stand as a sovereign and independent state. The die is thus cast, and her fortune is in the hands of the God of battle. Tyler has good handwritings too. We're thankful for that. So it's easy to read. He goes on to say that it's not going to be easy, because we're up against a united North, and they have more men and more resources. As a number of other people said at the time, including Robert E. Lee, this is crazy. We can't fight the North. But he goes on to compare. He says, well, the Greeks at Marathon defeated the Persians, and the Persians had a much larger army. And then, of course, our fathers defeated the British during our revolution, and the British had a much larger army, and we got the spirit that wants to fight. So we'll just have to see what happens. So that's a remarkable letter too. We have other letters by Tyler where he talks about what was going on with Texas and the Mexican War, and we have not even scraped the surface of what we have in our collection among the 9 million manuscripts. So those are the 10 documents we wanted to show you. And now, Paige, I guess we can look at questions we have.
Hi.
I'm trying to see which ones we should respond to. Well, most of the questions I'm reading were people.
Please. If you have questions, you can actually post a comment on Facebook or on YouTube. Or feel free to contact us also. Actually, but Bill, out of the 10 we've shown, I mean, you mentioned we have a lot more in our collection. What is one of your favorite objects?
I picked 10 of my favorites.
Okay.
I think and I'll tell you a story behind it. I'm fascinated with the Virginia Company of London Records. These were well known 100 years ago. They were published in our magazine 100 years ago. Our predecessors here did really good jobs of recording things, but I think everybody forgot they were here. And I discovered them simply by asking the computer the right question. Virginia Company of London. All of a sudden, this comes up. So one of the joys of working here is you never know what you're going to find. And then when I find manuscripts and I don't really know what to make of them, where they come from, I can turn to Paige and she can try to figure out. She's good at figuring out how we got them, how we acquired them. Well, we know that those we got from John Randolph in some manner. I don't know if we know exactly how. And another reason, not only does it have the charter of the Virginia Company in it, but it also had. I looked at a couple of other incidents, like the uprising of 1622. We used to call it the massacre, the Indian massacre, and you see what the instructions coming from London. And obviously there were a lot of instructions going and questions going back and forth because there are 3 of these huge volumes, and it was, I fell off the chair when I read what it said. It said that, you've been so nice to these Indians. You allow them to adopt our customs and our religions, and they're going around murdering you. Just basically exterminate them, or at least push them so far away that they won't be bothering you anymore. So that was rather astounding to read that. Another incident, I looked at the fact that Virginia established the first assembly, and how did that happen? And I wanted to see what instructions they were getting from London as to how to do that. And the governor of Virginia would write to them and say, well, how do we go about doing this? And they would write back and say, well, this is not easy. We'll get back to you on that one. That's hard. And they kept writing back and forth, and they never really gave them any instructions on how to establish a government. So it was done mainly by the people in Virginia. So those are just 3 of the discoveries within those records that I found, and so I would encourage anyone who's interested to go online to the Library of Congress website and look at the printed version. You can go even faster when it's in print, and even though the writing is beautiful in these copies, but you can read a lot. There's a lot of information in there.
Because I think one of my favorite items, one of the favorite manuscripts in the collection is I found when we were developing Unknown No Longer, which is a slave name database. And it's a it's a will from Peter Spain. And what he mentions is actually speaks volumes of what he doesn't mention. So in his will, he mentions his sisters, and Peter Spain is a freed Black man, and living in Richmond. His sisters live in Petersburg, and he mentions a young boy. He also mentions a woman who is legally his slave, but he says that she is his wife. But what he does is he leaves blanks where her name would be. And so that document just, when I read it, one, it's amazing. Two, I tried to find out more about who the woman was, but I was not successful yet, because it's something I keep looking for. Unknown No Longer is now available through Virginia Memory, which is Virginia Untold. It's the Library of Virginia's African American narrative. And through that, we did find Peter Spain, his manumission papers too. So it's a continuing story, which I hope to find more, as long as I'm allowed to, through our collection. So I'm not seeing any questions, but please feel free to, you can email us too, if you'd like, if something pops up later. But I guess we'll wrap it up.
We can have successive programs on this subject. We have 9
Oh
million,
my goodness.
9 million documents.
That would keep us busy, Bill. We could do one every week, basically. So for today's program is one of our many live and recorded online programs produced by the VMHC. If you haven't already seen what we have to offer, go to virginiahistory.org/at-home to enjoy a selection of podcasts, webinars, virtual tours, and hours of recorded lectures. You can reach us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram. And be sure to tune in on August 14th at noon for a new episode of Curators at Work, when Dr. Karen Sherry will be a part of a virtual panel discussion titled These Things Can Be Done, a new documentary that explores the often overlooked narrative of women's suffrage in Virginia, and premieres on VPM on August 13th. So thanks so much for watching, and please be safe.